We're going to go back 1,000 years through Trowbridge's history, and we're going to start off in Saxon times. In fact, we might go a little bit further back than that, because the Saxons were here in about 600, 700 AD, so quite a bit after the Romans had left. I'm standing here by Master Shoe, or the Court Hall, and I'm looking down Market Street and Silver Street. This is where the Saxon town was, or the Saxon settlement. It would have been here following along this line, and eventually it would have gone down, down, down through where the Shires is now, down to the River Biss. And over the River Biss there was a wooden bridge made out of, I suppose, a couple of tree trunks thrown across, and that's where Trowbridge gets its name. Tree Bridge is what it meant in Anglo-Saxon, and that became Trowbridge. And it would have been a very small place, perhaps a couple of hundred people, and would have been sort of simple wooden shacks for most people, although there was a stone church and there was also a sort of stone lord's house. There would have been, the Saxon lord was called a thane, and he would have lived in a sort of a great hall with all his retainers and his supporters, and everyone else would have lived in little sort of wooden shacks. And they would have even brought their livestock, their pigs and their sheep would have brought them in overnight, so they were safe from things like bears and wolves.
What was the first building built in Trowbridge?
That is a difficult question. The earliest buildings were built by the Anglo-Saxons, as we said. The church perhaps 1300 years ago, and none of those are there. None of the Anglo-Saxon buildings are here, but we know they were there. So I suppose the first building that is still standing is the church, the parish church of St James. It stood here for over 800 years. It was moved from being inside the castle, from where the old Saxon church was, to its current location by Henry de Bohun. He was the lord at the time, and it would have cost him no doubt lots of money, so it was a sign that Trowbridge was a little bit wealthier. And he started building this church. The only bit, we can't really see anything of his bit other than the foundation stones at the very base. Those are sort of the only really old bits, because over time it's been rebuilt. It's rebuilt in the 1400s, and it was quite a lot of it was rebuilt in Victorian times as well, as it's fallen to rack and ruin. I'm standing in Fore Street, and I'm looking at the town hall, and the street curves round, and it eventually goes down to Wicker Hill. And it curves because it follows the shape of the castle. Now, in 1066, William the Conqueror conquered the Saxon king Harold, and he crowned himself, and he became the first Norman king. And what the Normans did, they went to all the Saxon towns and villages, and they basically he put one of his supporters, so one of his knights, in control. And Trowbridge was given to a Norman knight. Eventually, through marriage, it went to the de Bohun family. There was several Humphreys and a Henry. And Humphrey de Bohun built a castle in about the 12th century, so about sort of 800, 900 years ago. We're not exactly sure when. And he built this great big curving castle with a great big ditch around it and a wall and a keep in the middle. And because he built it slap bang in the middle of the Saxon town, which meant all those Saxon peasants, they had to walk all the way around, down the edge of the castle, following what is now Fore Street, down to a new crossing by the river. And so they had a new crossing. There was a little bit of a ford there where they could cross, and eventually that became a new bridge. So the bridge that we have now is not the old Tree Bridge, that's a new bridge. And the de Bohuns were really important. They brought lots of money. Trowbridge was growing at this point. There was lots of things like lots of wool cloth, lots of wool production, lots of sheep and stuff like that. So they were selling wool, and it was getting a little bit wealthier. And what they did in medieval times, they laid out the town. So if we look around, sort of where Starbucks and Clark's and Monsoon and HSBC, they basically built lots of houses. And each of those houses had a medieval sort of a worker, tradesman. It might have been a cobbler, it might have been an iron worker who made horseshoes, it could be someone who was a butcher, anything really. And they lived in these houses called burgage plots, and they sold their wares from their their front room, which opened onto the street, and at the back there was a big yard where they did their job. That's their place of work, so they lived and worked, and that's what Trowbridge is like. So that because it follows the line of the castle, we get this curved Fore Street. So we're standing sort of slap bang in the middle of medieval Trowbridge.
Which building in Trowbridge is the most important historically and why?
That's a really good question, but it's not here. We're going to have to walk down Church Walk past the church, where we're going to find what I think is historically the most important building. So the answer to which is Trowbridge's most important building historically, well, there are probably several contenders. You could say the church, you could say one of the factories, perhaps you could say the Handel House, but I'm plumping for this building here, which is currently an estate agent's. It's a very old building, it's about 600 years old. It gives us a little glimpse back into what Trowbridge was like sort of at the end of the medieval period. It would have been quite a grand house at the time. It's what was called a hall house, so it goes down the side into Duke Street, and it would have been where a wealthy, perhaps a cloth merchant, perhaps a clothier, an early clothier would have lived. Above the main sort of shop front, it's got this bit that sticks out and it's called jetted, and they used to do that to increase the amount of space for it in each building without having to pay any more rent. So it's Trowbridge's only jetted building, and it's the best example of a medieval building, as I say, and so it links old Trowbridge, it links the cloth trade with modern Trowbridge. It's still there. I'm standing in Fore Street, sort of curving round to the top of Wicker Hill, and I can see the church spire, I can see some really grand Bathstone buildings, and I can see another medieval building hidden behind a bit of fake medieval, that's the Corals behind. At the time of the 16 and 1700s, sort of Tudor, sort of late Tudor and Jacobean times of Charles I and the Civil War and the early Georges, Trowbridge had become sort of like an industrial town, and making woolen cloth had become its main industry. That's pretty much what everyone was doing. They were involved in the processing of wool and the weaving of cloth and the finishing of cloth. And the people that called clothiers, they were sort of in charge of the various employees, the various workers, and they were in charge of the trade. They made loads of money. They were sort of the millionaires of their days, and because of that they wanted to show off, so they built really big houses. The Lloyds Bank over there is perhaps the biggest, but the NatWest, that's quite a grand house. The HSBC behind is not actually a clothier's house, but that's a merchant's house, and they had so much money they could afford to build the biggest and best houses, and so that's what they did. Okay, I'm standing at the top of Wicker Hill, looking at the parade, which again is another a block of sort of fantastic clothiers' houses. And we're going to walk down to the river in a minute, down to the Blind House. And I say these are more clothiers' houses. Really, really good examples. You can see the ornate carving. That would have been very expensive. They've got great big glass windows. Glass was very expensive in those days. So they're a sign of how much wealth and how much importance and power and status these clothiers had, these Georgian clothiers had. I'm standing by the Blind House, which is this domed building here behind me. We've got the river running along behind the Blind House and the new bridge, or what was the new bridge when it was built. And Blind House, well, that's a strange little building. It's actually the town prison when it was built. It's got two little cells, two little cubicles in it, and it was built to put things like minor criminals, really, I suppose. If you'd perhaps been a bit drunk and disorderly one night after a heavy night of drinking in one of Trowbridge's inns, you might get thrown in there. Perhaps if you'd stolen something, perhaps you'd stolen a loaf of bread or a few potatoes or something like that, or even a sheep. There are lots of sheep thefts in Georgian times. You'd be thrown in there, and then in the morning you'd go to the magistrate. There was one incident, however, in 1824, when there was a potato riot in Trowbridge. The price of potatoes was put up, and potatoes are a staple diet for most of the working people. And there was this riot, and the ringleaders of the riot were captured, they were arrested, and they were thrown in the Blind House overnight. I guess the next day they would have sent them to Salisbury, where they would have been tried. But overnight, their accomplices, their fellow rioters, broke in. They removed the tiles or they removed the tiles or the stones from the roof, made a hole big enough and so they could climb out and escape. I don't know what happened to them, whether they were ever caught again or whether they were forever free, we don't know, but that's the Blind House. The River Biss, it's going down there. Okay, it's not very wide, it's quite a small river, but it was really important in the woolen trade.
Was the river used for the woolen industry?
It was used for all sorts of processes, things like washing the sheep's fleece, which were very dirty and very oily, so they used to get water out for that. It was used in the dyeing process, when they changed the colours of the yarn and the colours of the cloth from its natural sort of off-white into reds, blues, browns, whatever colour you wanted. And it was used in the finishing process, what they used to call fulling, really. When they'd woven a piece of cloth, they had to shrink it, and they did that by beating it with an enormous great big hammer, which was about the size of, well, nearly as high as me. It was a great big thing, great big heavy wooden hammer, and it was powered by a water wheel, so the water was used for that as well. And they would pound the cloth, and as they pounded it, it got a little bit hot, and all the little woolly fibres felted together, and it shrunk a little bit. Then when they'd finished, they had a beautiful, really strong piece of woolen cloth. So the river was used for the fulling, it was used for the scouring, it was used for the dyeing, and it was also used to drive machines. And I'm standing by the river, and all around us I can see woolen buildings, old factories. Studley Mills behind us here, the Handel House here, I can see Inox Mills over there, all sitting by the river, because they all would have used water power at some point in their history. Court Street now, which is a little sort of back street that a lot of you might not have been in, but it's a very interesting little street. I can see Stone Mill over to my left, which is a stone-built factory building. In front of me I can see the Shires, but if I'd stood here 60 years ago I would have seen the great big Home Mills complex. And behind me and down on the right I can see brick mills. And they would have been something that the people in Trowbridge would never have seen before. I mean, that building down there has got 4 stories, the one further on has got 5 stories, and hundreds of people would have worked in here doing a different job on each floor. And of course, all those workers they've got to live somewhere. So instead of living out in the villages and the outlying areas where they would have lived, they all come and move into town where it's just a short walk. And so Trowbridge gets bigger, and over a period of about 20 years, from the start of the 19th century to about 1820, Trowbridge almost doubled in size. So it went from this fairly smallish town to a really big town. And by the 1850s and 1860s, in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, Trowbridge had become the biggest town in Wiltshire with about 11,000 people. And that's a sign it was a very, very important place. We've walked along Mill Street, and I'm standing at the bottom of Castle Street. On my left I've got what is now St Stephen's Place, where the restaurants and the cinema are, and that would have all been factories, that would have all been cloth factories. There was Upper Mills, Victoria Mills, Cradlebridge Mills, and then up the road we've got Castle Street, which goes up a little bit of a hill and it reaches Court Hall, or Mastershoe as it is now, which is our old Saxon bit again.
Where are the oldest weavers' cottages in Trowbridge?
Well, I can't answer that exactly, because they would have just sort of developed. There would have been, anybody who lived here would have pretty much worked in their home initially. So really we need to go to sort of the early 1900s. And if we look up Castle Street, we can see some 3-story buildings made out of brick. And on the top floor, they've got very, very wide windows. And they've got wide windows because cloth workers lived and worked in those houses. And the weaver, the man who made the cloth, it was usually a man by this point, he worked in that top floor, which isn't a bedroom, it's a workshop. So it has great big wide windows to let as much light in as possible. And so those are sort of the earliest buildings, the oldest specifically cloth workers' houses that we have. There are some more along Newtown and some in Yearbury Street. And if you look up, if you see any sort of Victorian buildings in Trowbridge that have got 3 floors, and just have a look at the windows on the top floor, and you can see sometimes they've been removed, but quite often you can see where the big wide windows would be, and that's a sure sign that it was a weaver's house, it was a cloth worker's house. We're in the marketplace. I've got the town hall behind me. I've got lots of shops and cafes and things in front along down both sides. And I'm looking down to Fore Street where it curves round. And we're sort of in the heart of Victorian Trowbridge, really.
What jobs were available when the mills closed?
At the end of the 19th century, so the 1800s, as I say, it was a large industrial town. There was lots of shops, there was lots of schools by this point, there was waterworks, gasworks, it had lighting, it had sewerage, there were lots of chapels as well as the church, lots of nonconformist chapels. And in 1889 the town hall was built, and that was sort of, I suppose, that put the seal on Trowbridge being an important civic town. It had a court here, it was the centre of the council, the local council that had been set up, and Trowbridge has sort of made it. It was a thriving, bustling town. War memorial now. This was erected in the early 1920s to commemorate all the soldiers that died in the First World War, and also then more names were added to it, so it commemorates those that died in the Second World War. It's in the park. On my left I've got what is now the Market Hall and the Castle Place and the multi-storey, but if we went back 100 years to Victorian times, or a little bit further than that, it would have been livestock market, so there would have been cattle and horses and sheep, etc. It was really just fields behind. Now it carries on. We've got sort of all built up modern Trowbridge, but this is also just fields as far as your eye can see. We've got a little mill over there, but it was pretty rural by this point in Trowbridge when the War Memorial was built. So we've finished our little tour and we're back in the museum. You can see a fantastic view over the rooftops of Trowbridge. We hope you've enjoyed our little virtual guided walk, should I say. And if you've got any questions, don't forget to email them to us and we can try and answer them. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoy it.